When you think about businesses like Allbirds or Skims that are selling through the roof, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But what's often overlooked is the business behind the business that makes it all possible. For millions of businesses, that's Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. With Shop Pay, you can boost conversions by up to 50%, meaning fewer abandoned carts and way more sales. Whether your customers are scrolling online, strolling through your store, or browsing social media, Shopify ensures you're ready to sell wherever they are. It's no secret, businesses that want to grow, grow with Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/DAX, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/DAX to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/DAX.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
If I'm not mistaken, this is like the most requested story we've gotten so far.
Yeah, it's been requested to us about 3 times, which is, yes, the most requested we've got from this. And it was a series that I had never actually heard of before. So I was quite surprised with how bombarded we were with it. But looking at it now, I can kind of understand. And I'm realizing now that we are going to follow this trend of British television shows brought over to the U.S. and being adapted for an American audience.
In case any audience members haven't looked at the title of this episode, we are talking about the American remake of Red Dwarf. I just got to say, from like a totally cursory glance, I was not familiar with Red Dwarf at all, except maybe heard the name in passing. Watching some things for today, including some of the versions of the US pilot that you can find out there, it did seem kind of obvious to me that this would be kind of the blueprint for stories of British TV shows trying to be made into American TV shows. Yeah. I'm not sure how the story behind the scenes is going to reflect this, but judging the differences on the 2 pilots felt a lot like a gas leak year episode of Community.
Well, there was that gas leak last year.
Oh, don't blame it all on a gas leak year.
Well, what I mean by that is there's a specific episode in season 4 of Community where they're doing an American remake of Inspector Spacetime, and all of the things that they change in that American remake to palette the American audience, it seems like it was very specifically similar to this story, where it was like, yes, they changed the same kinds of things for the American remake of this Red Dwarf show.
What they like about the show is that it's smart, complicated, and doesn't talk down to its audience. So if you'd like to make a really good American version, you should stay true to that.
Hey, instead of this constable, what about a blonde with long legs and a tennis racket?
So you're saying Pierce ruined Red Dwarf.
That's what I'm saying, exactly.
Yeah. Now, we can't always shit on the fact that anything that comes from the UK comes over to the US becomes a terrible show, because there has been excellent shows. And I know we've mentioned this before, like we mentioned Shameless, which is a wildly popular show. Obviously, The Office.
Yep. House of Cards.
Sanford and Son was one that surprised me. I didn't know that was originally a UK show, but it was. All in the Family was originally a show from the UK, and that was probably one of the best, well-beloved sitcoms in the US.
Yeah.
So it's unfair to say that anything that comes from the UK is made for an American audience is automatically going to be a terrible thing. It's something that's been tested out over and over and over again, and whatever you bring over, you're basically rolling the dice on whether or not it's going to be good. You've never seen this before. I've never seen this before.
No.
What was your hot take from watching the pilots?
I had not seen a frame of this show until I was researching for this episode. I started actually by just looking up clips of the show. I was going to try to find full episode that was like well regarded. And I know there's some full episodes of varying degrees of quality on YouTube and stuff. And I didn't feel like spending money on Amazon Video for any episodes. So I saw like a compilation of some of the best bits and scenes from the show. I am, and I know you are as well, Dan, I am a massive Hitchhiker's Guide fan and Douglas Adams. And so the idea of a British sci-fi comedy was something that's like, oh, these are three things together that I've enjoyed before. I wonder if I will enjoy it in this context as well. And from the scenes that I saw, it wasn't quite something I was really excited about. I think Douglas Adams is much more specific on like trying to bend the rules of reality. And like Red Dwarf does some of that with like the evolution of Cat is definitely something that seems like it's straight out of Hitchhiker's Guide. But a lot of the comedy kind of just more focuses on the differences between these two characters and how they relate to each other, as opposed to being absurd with crazy sci-fi concepts. It seems like the kind of show that I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to watching, but wouldn't go out of my way to watch. And then I watched the American pilots. There's some things that I definitely want to talk about with them when we get into the weeds of how they was developed later on. But just kind of on a surface level, it definitely prioritizes different types of relationships. And it doesn't seem like it was totally misunderstanding the show. I think it was trying to take some of the elements of that, but doing different things with some of those elements. And honestly, it wasn't in a way that I thought was too terrible. I think I would prefer the way the relationships are in the British version, but the American version, it made sense. It was a little more crass, but I guess I understand why it was made the way it was. And also then I finally followed up by watching the original British version pilot and realizing the characters and ideas and jokes that were in, you know, especially like the robot, he is in the American pilot, not in the British pilot, but I know is in the rest of the show. So clearly the American pilot was like, okay, here's some elements that we know work. Let's make sure to stick them in the pilot. And there's one or two jokes in particular that were not in the British pilot, but I have a feeling are in future episodes of the British show, just because it was like, oh my goodness, you guys are really leaning hard on this one gag.
It felt like they were taking the best of from the UK show and really trying to force it into this pilot. What's tough to do is that when you're dealing with an American show, and especially an American pilot, you do not have as much leeway when it comes to time, and you really have to condense so much of it. And with the US version, it felt like they were really jam-packing as much as they could. And you can even hear it from the beginning with the character Holly, who's kind of giving like this tour of the place in the beginning so that you immediately understand where you are, what this thing is, and it's doing it so quickly.
I'd like to welcome all our new recruits aboard the Jupiter Mining Corporation ship Red Dwarf.
The American pilot, I believe, was 25 minutes long, whereas the UK pilot was 30 minutes long. So I had 5 more minutes to mess around with some things. And you were talking about the different relationships that were being focused on. It felt like there was one relationship that was focused on a lot in the UK pilot, where when it switched over to the US pilot, you didn't get a sense of that relationship at all, and they were focusing
between the two main characters whose name now escaped me,
Lister and Rimmer. So Lister is the
kind of slobby guy, and Rimmer is the neurotic wannabe.
He's his superior.
Yeah, but in the American pilot, it definitely seems like, okay, we're going to just all focus on the schlubby guy, and here are a couple of other characters he'll be interacting with, but it was really spending so much more time setting up the plot, the rules of the world, setting up the idea, whereas the British pilot was mostly focused on, let's just establish the relationship of these two and how they're going to interact with each other. Even though it seems like it's going to be more Lister's show in the long run, it really is about Lister and Rimmer and not just about Lister.
Yeah, and I think part of that was that Crichton, who is the robot character, was introduced so early in the US pilot, where when you look at the UK pilot and you're just like, oh, he's not even there at all. It was something that was later on realized that, oh, he's going to be a main character. We have to introduce him even earlier. I think there's something about US media that says that main characters need to be introduced early in a television series or even in a movie. One example of that would be Sin City with Robert Rodriguez. So when Rodriguez had taken on the graphic novel, he actually didn't take on one long story. He actually took on 3 separate stories when he did that, plus a little intro and end there, but we're not going to include those. Those were just test shots that they spliced into the movie. But it's essentially comes down to 3 different stories. But you may notice that the Bruce Willis story comes early on in the movie. That story gets cut in half, and then we see the rest of the story at the end of that film, even though like characters who have died in previous stories suddenly show up in Bruce Willis's story later on because it falls earlier on the timeline.
Yeah.
Part of that had to do with the studio that was releasing it. I think it was Miramax that was releasing it. They said that you can't just have 3 separate stories and then towards the 3rd act of the movie, which is just the 3rd story, you can't just say, oh, and then here's a whole new story for you guys to deal with. They said, no, you have to introduce all of the characters, at least all of your main characters in the first half of the movie in order for this to work. This is the only way we'll accept it.
Yeah. The other big thing, though, that I think about in the American Pilot of changing the relationships, or not necessarily changing the relationships, but the way they focus on them, is that the American Pilot has to make it absolutely clear that our main character is motivated by sex and romance. And we got to introduce this girl right away and have this be the motivating factor for him, and have the idea of sex, and then also the way these 2 characters, how we've got our neurotic character who is much more sexually frustrated or whatever, and so much of the plot of this American version feels so much more obvious about how Americans are just obsessed with needing the romantic relationships and the sexual relationships, even to the point of the second American Pilot changes Kat into a woman as well and makes, oh, she's different about sex be so integral to her character. That was the part that really stuck out to me. And again, that was the same kind of thing with, the joke in that Community episode is like, oh man, now Inspector Spacetime is this suave playboy and his counterpart is now a sexy white lady with a tennis racket.
And now I must sleep with the sexiest woman here, who is also my grandmother, or I will cease to exist.
How do you know I'm not your grandmother?
Going back to like the British show, because I always like to compare to actual TV shows to better describe it. If you've never seen this before, I would say this is Firefly meets the format of the IT Crowd.
Okay.
It's a sci-fi comedy. It's a ragtag group just trying to keep the ship together. But the situation is aware that they are in front of an audience, that they are a sitcom, and you can definitely feel a lot of moments where they are playing to the crowd and kind of off the crowd, and just they have that pause for reaction, or they're anticipating that reaction with their deliveries.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, we can start getting into the history.
Into
So once again, we are doing another British show. Heading over to the Americas. I think by now we might as well just make this a regular segment every season. So
every season we've got to do at least one American remake.
There are so many, but yes.
Yeah, I feel like it would take a while for us to run out if we did that.
True. The series had begun in 1988, and it's still going on to this day. In fact, the last installment of Red Dwarf was Red Dwarf: The Promised Land, which premiered in April of 2020.
Oh, wow.
So when we were recording it, it came out with the new installment this year.
Dang.
So,
it's like the first season was 88?
88, yeah.
So it's been going for over 30 years.
This is older than It is older than The Simpsons. Think about that.
Oh, whoa. That is weird.
Now, you kind of have to give some forgiveness to this because The Simpsons have been going on consistently since 1989.
And the definition of consistency for British television is much different.
Yeah, because in its original run, it actually ran from 1988 to 1993. And each of those series had 6 episodes in each one of them. Now, keep in mind, I'm going off of the British term of saying series. When I say series, I mean season. And not the entire entity of Red Dwarf.
Yeah.
The show primarily takes place on a ship called the Red Dwarf, a Jupiter Mining Corporation starship. In the pilot episode, the ship is on a mission in deep space taking place around the late 22nd century. In the pilot, we meet our main character, Dave Lister.
It's stupid anyway, all this maintenance business. The only reason they don't give this job to the service robots is they've got a better union than us.
A low-ranking technician portrayed by actor Craig Charles, who prior to this was known as a punk-style poet. So he didn't really have much acting chops before then, but he was like a performative artist.
The hairstyle definitely stuck out to me, and I was like, is this something that how his hair actually is and how he keeps it? And did he do this specifically for the show? But when you say that he's a punk style performer, that makes me be like, oh, I would not be surprised if this was just the way he did his hair.
I'm pretty certain that's his real hair, and they just like, they plopped him in, and it's like, he's perfect for this role.
Yeah. Yeah, don't change a thing. You belong in the 22nd century.
So after he is caught bringing a cat, Frankenstein, on board, he is punished and put into a mechanism that puts him into stasis, where he doesn't experience the passage of time. While inside there is a radiation leak that kills all the passengers, but the computer keeps him alive until the radiation dissipates a mere 3 million years later. When he wakes up, it has been brought to his attention by the onboard computer Holly, the ship's AI computer with an IQ of over 6,000, that everyone is dead, and he is the last human alive.
Rimmer!
He's dead, Dave. Everybody is dead. Everybody is dead, Dave.
Wait. Are you trying to tell me everybody's dead?
Along with Dave, his cat Frankenstein has been kept alive and was also pregnant. So the character Cat, which we meet later on, is a humanoid cat, which is a descendant of Frankenstein.
He evolved from cats. His ancestors were cats. He's descended from cats. He is a cat.
Oh, yeah.
My guess is that he's also kind of a product of radiation, definitely a product of inbreeding and evolution. This is something that's going to be glossed over. I know, like, in the US version, they better explain how that happened. Like, the descendants of Frankenstein had, like, gotten so big, and then all of a sudden there was a big civil war, leaving only one cat to remain.
Yeah.
The British pilot, they just said, like, well, this is a descendant of Frankenstein, and there was only one left. So it's
fine. It works enough.
The cat is played by actor Danny John Jules, who is a singer and dancer and had a few small roles in the film The Great Muppet Caper, Labyrinth, and The Little Shop of Horrors.
Oh, wow. So just always hanging out around puppets.
Yeah. Cat was an eccentric character. He dresses up in fabulous clothes. He sings, he dances, and, of course, he acts like a cat.
Seeing him as kind of like portrayed as this like kind of like this flamboyant jazz era lounge singer kind of person, it really made me think they got the idea for this character because of jazz singers calling people's cat.
I'm looking better than nice. I'm looking dangerous. Ow! Dangerous! Ah! Hey, what's that?
The rest of the cast included Arnold Rimmer, a hologram of Lister's former bunkmate. Rimmer is portrayed by Chris Barry. He had worked with the creators of the show previously on a comedy series called Spitting Image, which I believe is still going to this day. I have to double check that.
Wow.
But I believe it's a puppet satire show.
Okay.
Other actors who auditioned for this role were Alan Rickman and Alfred Molina. In the show, the actual Arnold Rimmer is killed in an accident while he was trying to repair the ship's drive plate, which also causes the radiation, which also causes everyone to die. Holly, the ship's computer, makes a hologram of Rimmer so that Lister doesn't drive himself crazy. Ironically, though, Rimmer still drives Lister crazy. And I know Lister for a second was really hoping it was his, which I know in the UK version they do actually allude to him being with someone.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, cool, I get to be with her for the rest of this. But nope, that didn't happen. Rimmer is most notably known for having the H on his forehead, which you'd probably guess what that stands for. Hologram.
Stands for happy.
Yeah. When the character was first conceived, they wanted him to be black and white, but the technology to make him like that was so costly, and they decided not to go with that at all.
That would have been a cool effect, though.
Although they have been kind of messing with a lot of his costumes. So in the UK version, if you watch carefully, you'll notice that I believe if he's wearing blue, he can touch things or manipulate things, but it takes a certain amount of energy to do it. And if he's wearing red, you can walk right through him, or he can't touch anything at all, like a ghost.
Huh.
Yeah. Next, we have Crichton, a robot, or on the show, he is known as a service mechanoid that can only operate through few behavioral protocols. Dave releases him of those protocols and lets him have free will. The actor who played Crichton is Robert Llewellyn.
Oh, spin my nipple nuts and send me to Alaska. I'm supposed to take you asteroid spotting.
Who, prior to this, was on the comedy series The Corner House as the character Dave. Now, the cast seems to be very male-heavy, so to introduce some kind of gender diversity, they introduced the character Christine Kochanski, who's portrayed by Chloe Annette, who is mostly seen in visions and flashbacks, but much later on in the series, they find her alternative version in a parallel universe, which leads to her joining the crew, and Dave and Christine eventually have a child together. Spoiler alert.
Okay.
Even though the pilot episode of the UK version seems fairly tame, like as the show goes on, it gets much more and more wild, whereas like
oh yeah,
the US version, it seems like, oh, we are going to introduce the crazy like right away.
Well, again, I think the US version was just like, okay, here's all the things that this show is known for. Let's make sure to put that in right away.
Oh, yeah. The show was created by Rob Grant and Doug Naylor. Prior to creating Red Dwarf, the writing duo worked on a few comedy series like Carrots Lib, Three of a Kind, Cannon and Ball, and Spitting Image, like I mentioned before. The idea came from a sketch series Rob and Doug wrote for the BBC Radio 4 show Son of Cliché, called Dave Hollins, Space Cadet.
This is Stellar Trader, Dave Hollins, calling Earthcom number K57. My craft, Scion 4, is locked in a decaying orbit around a Class 2 planet. The main drives have gone, and there is no power left in the star hopper. I'm at a planet that has 2 suns and 7 moons. My AA number is Hall 71482.
So they wrote about 5 sketches about the adventures of Dave Hollins, who is marooned in a space far from Earth with his only companion, a computer named Hab. While developing the show, they drew inspiration from Star Trek, Silent Running, Alien, Dark Star, and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So that kind of makes sense as to why you got that vibe.
Oh, yeah.
After watching Dark Star, they changed the number of years that the main character was stranded from 7 trillion years, which was the original sketch, to 7 billion years, and then eventually settled on 3 million years to better explain the survival and the evolution of Cat. Many of the visuals used in the show were taken from the nuclear submarine Trident, which was featured on the BBC documentary Defense of the Realm. Since Rob and Doug had previously written for the BBC with Spitting Image, they pitched their idea to BBC and was rejected because the executives didn't really know or really were interested in a sci-fi sitcom. Because, like, if you think about that, that's kind of an out there concept. Like, Doctor Who is already out there, and you already have normal sitcoms that are out there. But, like, having a sci-fi sitcom just seems like a strange combination. You just wonder, like, how is it really going to work?
Whereas now I feel like we're much more used to just like, oh, yeah, you could just combine this genre with that genre and make a thing.
Yeah, and we're still seeing it now, especially, like, when you have something like The Orville with Seth MacFarlane. You also have Below Deck, which is kind of there to really make fun of like Star Trek, but also like to make just a comedy that's set in space, and there's no other way but to make it a sci-fi sitcom.
And when you get into animation, then your options really open up. I mean, Rick and Morty is a sci-fi comedy show.
But I can understand like this early on, like we've kind of accepted it now, but like this is still like a pretty foreign concept.
Yeah.
So in 1986, the show got picked by BBC North, which if anyone in the UK is listening to us, can you explain the differences between, because it seems like the BBC is just in charge of all television and media and radio. And I'm not really sure like what is the difference here. So there's BBC Radio, there's BBC 4, there's BBC North. So yeah, someone write into us and please explain.
How does British television work?
I don't know. BBC North picked up the show in 1986. Originally, the creators intended for this to be a radio show, just like with Dave Hollins' Space Cadet. But fortunately for producer Paul Jackson, he insisted that the show should be filmed and have a live studio audience and actually make it a sitcom. So in January 1987, they filmed the title sequence and were rehearsing the pilot until there was an electrician strike, which caused the production to go on hold until September. And then they finally aired the show in February 15th of 1988. Picked up in 86, filmed all throughout 87, which had to be frustrating for like one pilot episode to take a whole year. And then February 15th, 1988 is when we first see Red Dwarf. The series went on for six episode series up until 1993. Throughout the run of the show, we follow the crew as they turn the Red Dwarf around and make it back to Earth. Along the way, they have to deal with the end of humanity, Gelfs, which are genetically engineered life forms, psychotic androids, hyper-evolved animals, and vending machines.
A chucking nut bag without payment. Alert, alert. Shut up. Don't shout. Alert, alert.
If you don't shut up, I'll pour beef soup into your speaker and you'll drown.
Take your hand off my speaker then.
Promise to shut up?
Promise. My circuit's crossed. Alert, alert.
In the sixth series, the ship is hijacked with the crew left on a smaller ship called the Starbug, which then their mission just turns into they need to get the Red Dwarf back. So I think you may have seen the Starbug in the American version as well.
Okay. I don't remember that.
It's the ship that crashes into the snow planet on.
Okay. Yeah. I know what you're talking about now.
But the series didn't end there, but their continuous run did. In 93. The creators' partnership started to dissolve, and the cast and crew began to work on other projects that got in the way of filming Red Dwarf. This is where America thought that this was going to be the perfect time to steer the ship and make their own version of Red Dwarf.
And what year are we in again for this?
We are in 93 right now.
Okay.
Enter Brad Johnson, who at the time was the senior vice president of comedy development at MCA Universal Television. To make sure that this would succeed, he even brought over the original creators of the show, Rob Grant and Doug Naylor, to be executive producers and as writers. Mm-hmm. The American pilot was developed by Linwood Boomer, probably most known as Adam Kendall from Little House on the Prairie. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't mean this to like belittle him, because he actually did go on to like a very successful writing career, having written a few episodes of Silver Spoons and Night Court before getting the gig of Red Dwarf. He would later go on to write episodes for The Boys Are Back, Third Rock from the Sun, Townies, and was eventually the creator of Malcolm in the Middle.
Oh, wow.
Had the show been picked up, other writers that were considered were Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski, who both wrote for The Simpsons. Nearly all of the characters were recast, with the exception of Crichton, who was reprised by Robert Llewellyn.
Oh, come along, Sparehead One. Don't worry. This could be a great adventure.
Chris Berry as Rimmer. He was offered the role in the pilot, but he declined because the contract stated that he would have to be locked into the show for 6 seasons if they got picked up and if they went on that long. So he was like, I don't want anything to do with this. Apparently, Robert Llewellyn, he was like, what's the worst that could happen? He was also given the same contract, and he ended up agreeing to the terms. The casting for Lister was a bit of a surprise to everyone. In the British version, the actor who played Lister was Craig Charles, who was part Guyanese on his dad's side. Charles played his part as more of a simple man who likes cheap beer and chicken vindaloo.
Oh, chicken vindaloo. Nice one, Bob.
The role went to Craig Berko.
What brings you out into deep space?
Oh, that's a long story. I got into a drinking game. One minute I'm sitting in a bar in Detroit. Next thing I know, I'm waking up on a park bench on the fourth moon of Saturn wearing absolutely nothing but a traffic cone on my head.
A handsome, subtle white man someone who looks like they walked out of a Hallmark Christmas movie, and suddenly he acts like Han Solo all the time.
Yeah, that like jumped right out to me as they were like, yeah, we need a Han Solo type for this.
You spend your whole life just drifting and avoiding responsibility. I can't be in a relationship like that.
Wait a minute. I think I know what kind of commitment you're talking about here. You want me to make you my official girlfriend. My God, Chris, you know something? I think I'm ready to take that leap.
Which in the original Lister is not at all like that.
Yeah.
He's a smart ass, but he, in a way, knows his place. Like, he knows he's not going to get anywhere, so he can say whatever he wants, but he knows that, like, he'll be in this continuous state of punishment.
Yeah, I don't think you can make an American sci-fi anything anymore without having a Han Solo character in it, you know, or even an entire crew of Han Solo characters. In the case of both Firefly and Guardians of the Galaxy, it's just all Han Solos all across the board. Well, Guardians of the Galaxy is Han Solo who likes 80s music, with Green Lady Han Solo, with Muscle Bald Han Solo, with Tiny Raccoon Han Solo, and Tree Chewbacca. And I'm certain that when this Pixar Lightyear film comes out, that this version of Buzz Lightyear is going to have that same swoopy bang haircut and is going to have that same vest and smarminess.
Yeah. We really can't escape it now.
No, everybody's Han Solo.
Yeah, nowadays he's probably best known for his villainous role as Timothy in The Long Kiss Goodbye, and he nearly got the role of Joey in Friends, which now looking at him, you can kind of see the similarities there.
Yeah, you definitely can.
How are you doing? No. How you doing? What? How you doing? Damn it, Carl. Go wait in the hall.
What's crazy is that Craig, the actor who played Lister, he actually believed that he was the wrong choice for this role.
Casting me was a huge mistake, by the way.
Obviously.
Which you hear a lot of actors say. But it should have been like a John Belushi type guy. But America went, well, we'll do like a Han Solo thing.
And I see this as well. Like, he's a good actor. The thing is that he was not right for the role, and he understood that he wasn't right for the role.
Well, you know, you get far when you're a handsome white guy in Hollywood.
Yes. Yeah. Rimmer was played by Chris Eggman, who before had one acting credit in the film Metropolitan as Nick Smith. You might better know him as Lionel in Malcolm in the Middle, or Jason Stiles in Gilmore Girls, who actually dated Lorelai for a few episodes.
This is exactly the reason why I hate hiding relationships.
I know.
We're gonna get caught.
We can't tell them.
We're gonna get caught.
This was just a freak occurrence.
This is destined to be repeated.
They'll be mad that I hid it.
They'll be madder the longer you hide it.
They'll screw things up. I don't want that. I like us.
But it's inevitable.
I've watched through all of Gilmore Girls. I remember Peter Petrelli was in there, and that's about it.
Yes. So the role of Kat, that went to Hinton Battle.
Yeah, that's not bad. Let me take this one from the top.
Who is a 3-time Tony Award-winning Broadway actor who is best known for being the first actor to portray the Scarecrow in the stage version of The Wiz, who would later on, when the film came out, that was played by Michael Jackson. For Buffy fans, we may know him as Sweet, the demon that causes everyone to sing and dance in that musical episode.
Why'd you run away? Don't you like my style?
That is literally the only episode of Buffy I saw. It was like a couple of months ago. I think Alexa and I were talking about musical episodes of TV shows or something like that. And she was like, you have to watch this episode of Buffy. That's Kat, right?
Yep, that's Kat.
Oh my goodness. I can't believe I didn't put that together. That's hilarious.
But like, that's the perfect casting for that role.
I guess it would make sense that I didn't put that together because that American pilot was super low quality. And
it was.
He's introduced completely in the shadows.
Yeah, I mean, this pilot was not officially released, and the reason why this pilot is out is because someone got a hold of a copy, and this is around... Remember, this is the early 90s, and the only way to copy this is going from VHS to VHS, and every time that you copy from VHS, it just gets lower and lower in quality.
Yeah.
So this is just years of trying to preserve that as much as possible. But this copy has been actually sold at conventions either, and that's the reason why it's still alive. So whenever there's like a Red Dwarf convention or a sci-fi convention, like these are being sold out there. Even the actors from the original Red Dwarf, they have been asked so many times about the US pilot, and none of them had ever seen this before. In fact, a lot of them weren't even informed that the US pilot was being filmed in the first place.
I found out about the Red Dwarf pilot from the makeup lady, Andrea Finch. She was making me up, and I said, what you do next time? I'm just going over to America with Robbie. I said, what for? She'd over to do the Red Dwarf American show. And no one had told us about it. And Robbie hadn't told us about it. And we just felt like cheated.
Yeah, it was much of a surprise to them from when they found out that it was being shot. And then they were being asked so much that they were like, well, we got to get our hands on this. And a number of them actually bought copies of the American pilot from these conventions from people who had saved and copied this unaired pilot episode. So I really don't know how it got leaked out there, but it seemed like on Universal's side, and we'll get there later, it seemed like they didn't really care what happened to the show after they did the pilot and decided not to do it.
Yeah.
So for the role of Holly, they cast the British actress Jane Leeves, who would go on to play Daphne Moon in Frasier.
I'm trying my American.
Certainly trying this American.
Yeah. Anything on the patio? All right, cool. I'll see you then.
You see, I'm just sick of people making such a fuss about my accent.
Yeah, but it seems kind of odd that if you're going to be making an American show, like, I feel like you should just make it all American actors. I know it seems unfair.
I don't know. I think whoever the best actor for the role is. One of the first moments that I realized that somebody could be just doing a totally different accent for something was watching the show Chuck.
Mm-hmm.
The lead actress in that, she's from
Australia.
I don't remember where she's from. Yeah. And so she speaks with like a really thick, not American accent, and it was so strange hearing her in interviews and stuff. And I was like, this is not what I'm used to.
I watched House first, and that's when I got to really know Hugh Laurie. And I never realized that I've watched Hugh Laurie before. Like, Hugh Laurie was in 101 Dalmatians, but like, how are you going to remember that Hugh Laurie was in 101 Dalmatians? But like, because he was so prominent on the show House, and then I heard an interview with him, I was like, oh, he's British. And he actually did a sketch show with Stephen Fry. I was like, yeah.
A lot of Americans will say, in a kind way, they will say, you managed to lose the accent. And which always strikes me, I have to sort of explain that I'm not losing an accent, I'm putting one on. You're the one with the accent. Yeah.
There's got to be American actors who've played British or different actors that have
British characters a bunch? Oof.
British audiences thinking that they're British and not American originally. I wonder if there's got to be a vice versa of someone like that somewhere.
Yeah. I feel like I haven't heard that, and I feel like the joke is more that British people are amazing at doing American accents and American people are not amazing at doing a British accents. But again, that's always come from an American perspective of making fun of that. So I'm not sure. Maybe it does go both ways.
So if any UK listeners are out there, please, one, explain the BBC and the many different branches of that. And if you have been fooled by an American actor thinking that they were British. Yes. So yeah, we're going back to the casting here. So we're going to Holly.
My memory is shot, all my circuits are breaking down.
Actually, that one felt kind of good.
In this version, they made Holly a woman right from the beginning, when in the UK version, Norman Levitt played Holly and would eventually, occasionally, switch to the actress Hattie Hayridge.
There was a miscalculation. My IQ has doubled, but my life expectancy has been exponentially reduced.
So what is your life expectancy? 345 years? Well, it's better than a kick in the bread tray.
What's the decimal point?
You have only 3.41 years left to live?
That's not years, that's minutes, 3.41 minutes.
Well, here's my next question. What the smeg are you going to do?
So they would go back and forth between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Had the series been panned out, The US version might have played around with Holly's gender identity, but who knows where that would have gone. And then lastly, to play Kochanski, who is Lister's love interest, that was Elizabeth Moorhead.
I don't think this is the time or the place to do this.
When Linwood Boomer, he's the guy who was in charge of running the show. He's the one who eventually made Malcolm in the Middle. When he submitted his first draft, there were a few changes that were made that had to be immediately addressed. For example, Rimmer's iconic H had been replaced with a big red circle, which seems like more of a metaphor of like a red flag or the red circle of doom for if anyone owns an Xbox. Luckily, that did not stay in the script. There is a claim that there was about 14 writers, a lot of them coming from The Simpsons and Cheers, to work on this pilot. This is according to the actor Llewellyn. They were so focused on punching up the script with one-liners that the story seemed to lose a lot of the fundamentals. The creators thought it might be best if they stepped in to help. Since their names were going to be on the project, they might as well try and help it out. They actually wrote a script overnight and had it ready by 8 in the morning. The creator showed the script to Boomer, and he refused to even acknowledge it and said that they were going to go with the originally developed script. Rob and Doug felt helpless and went back to their hotel rooms to drink champagne, which was originally there to celebrate, but now it just seemed like they were just trying to cope with their nightmare.
Sorry, that just reminds me of a scene in BoJack where it's like, yeah, forget the victory scotch, bring out the consolation scotch.
Yes. It was then that they got this idea that they should go back to set and start telling the cast members that there's actually a new script. Actually, most of the cast was not a fan of the first one, so this got people really excited. And then they started to demand that Boomer at least give them a chance to read it.
Wow.
Yeah. The director had caught wind that there was a new script, and the cast members did get a chance to read it. So he asked everyone if they should film the new script, and it was nearly unanimous that the cast had said yes to this new script.
Have you ever heard the story of a similar type of thing with Seven, the Fincher movie?
No.
The studio wanted a different ending, different than the now famous What's in the Box scene. And I'm not sure what that different ending was. I'm just kind of reciting this from memory, but basically the studio demanded a different ending, but then when it came time to start like sending it out to actors and stuff to get them interested, the writer purposefully sent off the wrong script with the original ending, and then the studio was like, oh no, that's the wrong one, we want this one. And then it might have been Kevin Spacey or somebody was like, no, this is the movie that I want to make, and wouldn't sign on unless they restored the original ending. I could be totally botching the details of that. I'm trying to remember that. There's definitely something to do with a similar thing happening on Seven.
Interesting. So they kind of filmed both in a way where they were doing like alternative takes as well. It's like, okay, so we are satisfying the creators of the show. We're satisfying a lot of the cast of the show with this. But also, Boomer's the one who's ultimately head honcho making the final decisions. Also needed to cater to him and say like, okay, well, we're going to film kind of alternative takes so that everyone's kind of happy with this.
Is it going to be like the alternate take of the kiss in Star Trek?
Oh, yeah.
You ever heard that story?
He kept on looking up at the camera.
Yeah, they wrote this kiss between Kirk and Uhura, but it was going to be the first interracial kiss on American television. The studio was like, well, they were all antsy about it. So they demanded that there would be another take of the characters just hugging instead of kissing. So on the take where they were hugging, William Shatner looked directly into the camera lens. And of course, with those cameras, the only person who saw exactly what the camera saw was the DP. And the DP just goes, yep, we got it. Let's move on. Knowing that they couldn't use that take and they would have to use the kiss take.
That's amazing.
So great. I'm just imagining a similar type of thing happening on the set of this.
Yeah.
That's got to be a crazy thing to do alternate jokes for like every beat of the pilot you're filming. Like you're filming two separate pilots.
If you think about it, like it seemed like most of it was going to stay the same, but with sitcoms, and I know Friends, I believe it's season 5 on the DVD set. Sorry for those who are just streaming Friends, but on the DVD set, they have a really interesting behind the scenes of how to make one episode. They actually go through from the writer's room to filming it to editing it. They actually go through the entire process of what goes into one episode, and it is fascinating. It's not unusual for a scene to introduce new jokes and do different takes or new takes, thinking that, well, that one wasn't bad, but let's do an alternative joke version of it because we don't know which one is going to land better. There was one scene in particular which was really interesting. It's where Ross and Rachel, they get married in Vegas and they just elope somewhere. And then we see Chandler, Monica, and Phoebe come in. And Chandler's line, which was supposed to be the punchline of it, was saying like, Phoebe asked him like, oh, I didn't even know they were together. And Chandler says,
I don't think there's much dating as they are drunk.
It's a funny line, but it wasn't landing as well. And they could tell from the audience as well. And they're like,
yeah.
So they heard that. They all reconvene. All the writers are actually on set and they're like, oh, crap, we have to rewrite this now. We have to figure out what's funnier. And what they ended up doing was like, well, Matthew Perry's funny. Let's bring him in. And he's like, okay, I got an idea. Just trust me on this.
It's going to be a I love you, I know situation.
Yeah. So they trust him. He goes out there and the line turns into, I didn't even know they were together. He's like,
well, I don't think there's much dating as they are 2 bottles of vodka walking around in human form.
Wildly, that is so much better. They trusted their actor on this one, and they're like, perfect.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
That retake. And it's not like they have to do a whole new setup for anything. The cameras are staying in the same place. The set's the same thing, so it's not too difficult to actually do that.
Yeah. But the weird thing with the Red Dwarf is like, here is this person that's like, no, the comedy's going to be this way, when literally everybody else wants to go the Joey route and try to add a different dimension to it. But the person in charge is like, no, we're going to do it my way.
It's interesting how they put it together. But Robert Llewellyn, who is the common denominator between the two of them, he noticed like a big difference between filming in the UK versus the US. And he actually, I didn't think this was real. Robert Llewellyn actually wrote a book called The Man in the Rubber Mask. It just feels like the actor's studio. It kind of feels like that and be like, in my book, The Man Behind the Wig.
Yeah.
It feels like that. Anyway, but he wrote in detail about this. He said that he first noticed that the set was much bigger and he no longer had to duck while going through doorways. The other difference was the attitude. So for the UK actors, they had a lot more fun between takes. Some cast members mimicked humping set pieces, while a lot of the American actors took the roles more seriously and were very easily distracted. I mean, like, for fuck's sake, it's a sitcom.
Yeah.
Like, if we're not all laughing, like, not everyone's going to laugh when you do the scene. Oops, I knocked my stand there. For the most part, the pilot, after filming in front of a enthusiastic live audience, it did actually feel like a success. The laughter that you hear in the American pilot, like, that's for real. That is not canned laughter.
Oh, I'm sorry. You want to be dumped in private. How insensitive of me.
So let's dive into the pilot and how it differs from the UK version. So the US version begins with these Star Wars scrolling text, which whizzes by way too fast for the audience to read.
Good little bit.
Yeah. It briefly describes the future, and then it finally slows down to where you can read what you really need to know for this story. I'm just like, well, why even include that? That just...
I thought it was a pretty funny gag there.
Like you were mentioning before, it feels like these things were later used in a future episode of the BK version. But yeah, that Star Wars scroll was actually used later on in an episode of the British Red Dwarf. After the exposition text, we see what seems like a placeholder theme song with a montage. Some of the UK footage was actually used in the montage and mixed with some of the stuff that was filmed for the pilot, which, given that this wasn't really made to be released, that's kind of forgivable that they would use those clips from the original.
Mm-hmm.
Then we are given a tour of the ship, which is narrated by Holly.
The Red Dwarf is equipped with every possible convenience. We wish all our new recruits a warm welcome. Please proceed now to your assigned zones.
Right away, this kind of feels like a documentary with so much exposition front-loaded in the episode. I can see why audience kind of turned away from this from the beginning.
Yeah.
But it seems like all of this was actually for Crichton, who had just boarded the Red Dwarf.
Must have made a wrong turn somewhere. You should have made a left at the last intersection, Crichton. Be quiet, sparehead one. I know what I'm doing. Boy, I hate backseat drivers.
It's odd that Crichton is in the pilot because he's not in the UK pilot episode. In fact, he isn't a regular until series 3 of the British Red Dwarf.
It's one of those situations where any Americans who might be familiar with the Red Dwarf already are going to expect to see that character.
Yeah, that's true. I mentioned that Robert Llewellyn wasn't Crichton until series 3 as a regular, but he actually appeared one time, or at least Crichton did, in the second series, but that was actually played by David Ross, a different actor.
Mm-hmm.
After Crichton's introduction, we are introduced to Lester and Rimmer bickering as Lester makes his way to his bunk.
I will not tolerate non-discipline. And that is what's made me the leader that I am today.
Oh, come on, Rimmer. There are 5,000 people on this ship. You're in charge of me and 2 animated shoeboxes.
Much like how the UK version began.
There are 169 people on board this ship. You, Rimmer, are over 1 man. Why can't you two get on?
You see, I try, sir. I'm not an insubordinate man by nature. I try and respect Rimmer and everything, but it's not easy because he's such a smeghead.
And instead of it being 2 misfits separated by where they place their neuroses, whether they're extra lazy or extra, like, obsessive, now it's the cool, sexy guy versus the lame, neurotic nerd.
Yeah. It's the stick up the ass guy versus Chris Pratt.
Yep.
It's, yeah. Something that was brought up in the pilot right away is the relationship between Lester and Kochanski. In the UK version, Kochanski is just a memory to Lester and eventually would end up dating, like I mentioned before. In the US version, it's implied that the two of them dated prior to being on the ship.
Is that the problem? By being a nice guy? Because, I can change, Hey, whatever.
No, that's the problem. Hey, whatever.
But she breaks up with him when he feels like she's above him.
Yeah.
I know you haven't watched Jurassic World, but this is exactly the relationship between Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard. Bryce Dallas Howard is like operations manager because she doesn't own it. She's like the operation manager, like the top of Jurassic World. And Chris Pratt is this guy who was former military man. We talked about this in Jurassic Park 4. He's the military man made for hire. He comes in, he trains the raptors, and you're like, these are 2 completely separate people in kind of 2 completely separate worlds. Like, there's no reason for, like, the head manager of a theme park should be dating, like, the guy who trains the raptors. It just seems odd that they got together before that. And it seemed odd, which spoiler alert for Jurassic World, that they even got together at all. I don't buy their relationship, and I don't buy the relationship in this either. Yeah. I like the idea from the UK version. The girl that Lister was interested in was also someone who's kind of a lackey, someone who wasn't higher up, but also was there as like, I am interested in you, even though we are not together. And they kind of have that flirty moment in there, which I like.
So how are you then?
Fine.
Do you know what he wants to see me for?
Yes, I think you've been promoted to Admiral.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, for your diligence and general devotion to duty.
It sets up like a nice establishing relationship of like, oh, those 2 could be together. Not that these 2 people who have completely different personalities were dating. They're not dating anymore, and he wants her back. I didn't like that at all.
But you gotta have that will they, won't they?
Of course. Something that wasn't working in the US pilot was the delivery of jokes. So a lot of the jokes were recycled, but there had to be enough of a difference to tell them apart. It seemed like the UK version, they found the best way to deliver certain jokes. And when it came to the US version, the delivery fell flat because the best way had already been done. So, for example, when Crichton introduces himself in the US version, he states that his full name is
Crichton 2XB 517P. Although I don't really like the 2XB part. I think it's a rather jerky middle name.
Where in the UK version, Lister reads out his full name.
Crichton 2X4B 523P. That's your full name.
Personally, I don't much like the 2X4B. I think it's a jerky middle name.
It feels like if I were to introduce myself as like, hey, my name is Daniel Thomas Kaka, but I don't really like the Thomas part. I feel like that's rather jerky. And it's like, that doesn't really sound right coming from me. But if someone was like, oh, you're Daniel Thomas Calkin. I'm like, yeah, you can leave out the Thomas part. That's unnecessary.
Yeah.
Like, that comes off a lot better and more natural in this instance. The jokes were there. They just weren't working as well. In both the UK and the US version, Lister does sneak a cat on board, but in the US version, they actually do explain why, rather than Lister just has a cat.
Hey, I had to do it. They eat cats on Titan. Saw him through a restaurant window. He was sitting on a bed of lettuce under a heat lamp.
I applaud your sensitivity, sir, but I really don't think you're being realistic.
What do you mean?
Well, this cat is quite clearly pregnant.
He is?
Now, Crichton is an accomplice when the cat is discovered by the captain, and when asked about the cat, Crichton blows up because he can't tell a lie.
Emergency override sequence Alpha 4, Alpha 9. Where's the damn cat?
If you notice his eyeballs going into the coffee, there was one guy in there, which I feel like was an ad-lib joke that he put in there. He says,
You know, in certain countries, that's considered a delicacy.
I think it's alluding to Indiana Jones, where they have the soup, the eyeball soup. I think that's what he's alluding to.
I think it's a common trope. Different places like weird foods.
But I think for this version to work, especially if you're dealing with a space sci-fi, if he said on certain planets, that's considered a delicacy, I think he should have said it that way. But that's just me.
I also find it interesting that, you know, the American pilot feels the need to explain why he has a cat and go through this whole scene about it. Whereas in the British version, he just has a cat. And honestly, like, that seems totally fine and normal and rational for this guy to just has a cat. Of course the guy just has a cat.
I do love the exchange that he has with this captain.
Not only that, but you take a photograph of yourself with the cat and send it to be processed in the ship's lab. Now I'm going to ask you again. Do you have a cat?
No.
The American version, he doesn't make any silly mistakes like that. Whereas, you know, in the British version, he is an idiot who took a photo of himself and the cat and left it around where somebody could find it.
Yes.
But the cool, sexy American, his only weakness should be his pride and his obsession with sex. Really got to turn everybody into a Jeff Winger in America.
We do. Now Lister is given the option of going into stasis or giving up the cat. He chooses to go into stasis because that's how the UK version worked, and there would be no show otherwise if he didn't. Now, since Lister does save the cat, this gives a glimmer of hope for Lester and Kochanski's relationship.
Listen, I heard what you did. I probably would have done the same thing in your shoes.
So yay, we're getting the they just might. Since the American pilot was just so jam-packed with other exposition, which in the UK version was either spread out to other episodes, not realized until later episodes, some of the crucial storylines did get cut down. So in the American pilot, we see that Rimmer is focused on studying for an exam to become an officer, basically writes down an entire textbook on his arms and legs, takes the exams to find that his notes have smeared, and claps like a fish to get out of it. That part is like a really well thought through storyline that does have a really good payoff, but in the US version, it feels like something had happened off screen. And then we catch a glimpse of it when Rimmer comes out of the exam room and he says,
I think I did really well this time.
Had you not known the British version, you would have no idea what's going on. And for the American audience, they're just like, yeah, I don't know what the context is here. So
again, I think the American version is less interested in the friendship between these two characters and more interested in our main character trying to get laid.
Yes. Lister wakes up 3 million years later. There were two jokes in there, which, again, the UK version did it better. And I'll admit, whenever the US version does something better as well, like, I think the US version explaining why Lister has a cat is better than the UK version. But like, in this case, the joke where Holly is telling Lister that everyone is dead. In the UK version, they have this drawn out segment where he's like, everyone is gone, everyone's deceased. And then he finally gets it that everyone is dead. And then he tells him, oh, it's 3 million years later. And this joke, you don't hear it as well, and it doesn't land like a punchline.
3 million years! I've still got that library book.
That is far more funnier than
My baseball cards must be worth a fortune.
And you can tell he's really playing to the audience. Like, even in the low quality version that you see, like, you can see that he's like making this big face that his cards are now worth a fortune.
Not to keep harping on the same point, but it's like another evidence of like the differences in the character, where one is out of luck, wash up. He's thinking about a small thing in his life that went wrong, and now he's got this library book that's 3 million years past due. Whereas our other character is thinking about the personal gain of it, and that's his immediate reaction is, oh my goodness, I can get a lot of money from my baseball cards.
I think Stephen Fry, he talked about the difference between American humor and British humor, what the key difference is. And he says that with American humor, you are kind of laughing in the expense of someone, but someone comes out on top. Whereas in British humor, you're more self-deprecating and you're okay with the one being the butt of the joke. And that person is looked upon as like the star of that. So you look at something like Johnny English versus the Melissa McCarthy movie Spy. Melissa McCarthy comes out on top, and in a way, Johnny English does come out on top, but a lot of it is in the expense of him.
Whereas, you know, Melissa McCarthy's Spy is much more about preconceived notions and stuff like that. But yeah, the whole, like, punching up and punching down does definitely seem like something that talking about those two ideas does seem to apply much more to American comedy than it does to British comedy.
Oh, yeah, it does. At the end of the pilot, we see future versions of themselves trying to warn the crew of something, but they disappear just before they get a chance to say that.
Just give them the message. We're out of time.
Okay, this is very important. Everything hangs on. You gotta...
What are you doing?
You heard him. I gotta...
Got to what?
Well, I gotta try to get us back home.
This is something that happens later in the UK version, but not necessarily in the pilot. Again, so jam-packed in this episode, it's hard to focus on what the goals of each characters actually are. But the point of the scene is to prompt Lister to turn the ship around and head back to Earth, which is in the original. And that is a conclusion that Lister comes up with on his own in the original.
No, it's not Cloyster. It's me, it's Lister. It's Lister the Stupid. Who shall returneth to lead us to Fushal, the promised land? No, it's not Fushal, it's Fiji. And I'll lead you there. That's where we're going. Holly, plot a course for Fiji. Look out, Earth. The slime's coming home.
Whereas, well, I guess Lister kind of comes up with it, even though it's kind of a message from himself to go back to Earth. But, like, that's eventually the goal for Red Dwarf is we got to go back home.
That seems like another odd thing where it's like American TV needs to have this, like, big, grand quest. It's not enough that it's just a group of misfits trying to get home. There's also something else going on. It feels very much like the painting on the floor at the first episode of Heroes of New York exploding or that kind of thing.
It just feels like there's always going to need to be a buildup. There's always needs to be a cliffhanger. It can't be like on this next adventure of Red Dwarf, it's like, oh no, we are actually getting somewhere.
Yeah.
After the credits, we get a coming up in the series where they take clips from the original UK version and splice it in to get executives excited for the series and see its potential. This is like the theme song montage that we saw at the beginning. So a lot of this, it seemed like a placeholder, again, because this wasn't going to be played on the air. So it seems like this was, whoever released this copy was definitely catering towards the executives and the producers who would back this up.
Yeah.
So remember before how I said that there were essentially two versions of the pilot episode that were filmed?
Yeah.
So it was found out later that a lot of the plot points that were added by Rob and Doug did not make it into the final cut of the pilot. A lot of the one-line punch-ups were left in, but as a result, the pilot ended up looking like Boomer's version anyways. Shortly after, the creators were soon invited back to the US to shoot a few more scenes to help create a promo and add some scenes to help improve the pilot episode. This was considered the second pilot, which seems kind of unfair to call it that because it came out to be like 10 minutes of just
clips
footage that they spliced in later for various purpose. So yeah, this is when I sent you, it said like, hey, you got to watch these 2 clips. They're 2 separate American pilots. You're probably confused as to like, why is there 2 and why am I kind of seeing but it seemed like they came in just to kind of say, hey, whoever the executives were just like, we want to see more of this and kind of where can it expand to. Rather than watching the UK version, they were just kind of saying like, okay, if this was translated to the US, what is really going to happen? And that's really why they were brought in. So they were given a shoestring budget, just a few $1,000s, and they filmed it in what seemed like a shed and not really a soundstage from where they originally filmed the pilot. A major change that happened was the casting of Cat. So that was Terry Farrell.
You stay here and suck your thumb, and I'll go and rip off its head, spit down its throat, and turn its lower intestines into balloon animals.
Who was best known for her role in Star Trek Deep Space Nine as Dax.
I would not be so hasty.
I take it the scenery has improved.
For Rimmer, they got Anthony Fusco.
I can't believe it. I'm dead.
What's it feel like?
Death? It's like being at an Amish bachelor party.
Who had done a lot of small roles, predominantly in Law and Order in the 90s.
Going back to that episode of Community about Inspector Spacetime being remade, the black male character becomes a white sex-crazed lady.
This had to inspire Community.
I can't think of any other examples, but I feel like Community can't be the only show that did a bit about an American remake of a British show and probably used some of the same jokes of making everything sexed up and super cool.
I mean, they did it kind of in episodes as well, where they were transferring the show over to the US and who was supposed to be this charming, endearing old man of a teacher was then turned into a young, hot woman.
Yeah. The story around this pilot in particular kind of created the trope.
Yeah. Chris Berry, he was again offered to reprise his role as Rimmer, but because of the contract that could possibly lock him in for 6 years, he also declined the role again. So Danny John Jules, he was asked to play Cat. He's the UK Cat actor. He couldn't because of scheduling issues. So they couldn't get Danny John Jules at all for this. And they basically couldn't get any of the original actors from Cat. And they're like, well, we're going to try and look around to see who could best play that. And Terry was still, I guess, the best one. And when Terry was cast, this is when Red Dwarf got the unofficial name, at least from the UK cast, as the White Dwarf, because now all of the actors are white. It's not looking good for them.
America!
Yeah.
It was White Dwarf. The cat was a white woman. Lister was a 6'4" blonde-haired, brown-eyed sex god. And it was like, in the future, it was like black people, someone's planning on us not being here.
In the new pilot, there was an uncomfortable scene with Rimmer and Lester talking about Lester's lust for Wilma from the Flintstones, and Ringer brings up Betty, and Lester...
Do you have any conception of how crazy you sound? You're talking about going to bed with Wilma Flintstone.
Yeah, you're right. It's nuts. She'll never leave Fred. I know it.
In the UK show, this was actually an exchange between Lister and the cat.
What'd you think of Betty?
Betty Rubble? Well, I would go with Betty. But I'd be thinking of Wilma.
And now it just kind of feels weird with that character swap. But the reason why they did this is because they needed to show that Lister and Rimmer were bunkmates, which in the US version did not show any of that whatsoever. You did not know that they actually lived together, whereas in the UK version, there were so many scenes of them being bunkmates that it was then later accepted. Have you ever heard the pilot episode of Game of Thrones? And when it was tested to an audience,
no,
it failed miserably. It was an awful show. It's a miracle that it even got to where it was, because after the pilot episode of Game of Thrones, they actually asked the audience, they're like, hey, Cersei and Jaime, did you know that they were brother and sister? And the whole audience was like, I had no idea that I thought they were just lovers. And they're like, oh no, they're actually brother and sister. Okay. And they ended up refilming like half of that pilot episode and made it so much better because of it.
When you're adapting a book into something for the screen, if you follow too closely to the original source material, there's details like that don't make sense, because in a book you can say they are brother and sister, but you have to communicate that information in a very different way for it to work in, film or TV. And so I wonder if that was a situation where they were trying to film the events exactly like they happen in the book, but then it doesn't actually establish some of the information that they need to get across.
Yeah, and I'm always bothered by anyone who says, oh, the book was better than the movie or the TV show. Mm-hmm. And to me, I see that as a very pretentious statement of like...
It's sort of an easy criticism, too.
Because most people have not read the source material. And I feel like there's this gatekeeping mentality of like, oh, since I read the book, I deserve the better version of the story. The way I look at it is like, with books and movies, they have such a different type of beast to deal with.
Yeah.
A good example of like a good translation from a book to a movie, I think, was The Hunger Games. Mm-hmm. The Hunger Games had to deal with something where you had Katniss going through the game. There was one part where she was actually describing the tracker jackers, those big old murder hornets. And she had to describe like what would happen if you got stung by them and what damage they could do. Since you're in Katniss's head the entire book, it's acceptable to read her thoughts. This is from her perspective.
Yeah.
If you're watching the movie and all of a sudden she has like this narrative voice during the game where she sees the tracker jackers, we're not going to stop for that moment and be like, okay, guys, here's what's going on. Those things are tracker jackers. She's not going to do like an Elfie moment where she looks at the camera and explain everything that's going on. But the smart thing that they did for the movie, they ended up having announcers for the game. And that was never in the book. The book never had announcers at all, but the announcers are there to really explain
the
what's
rules
going
and
on.
What's happening.
Yeah.
It's
and explaining the world.
Makes perfect sense.
So the rest of this so-called pilot episode, Lester is giving a distress call, which cuts away to a lot of the scenes from the pilot with new shots of Terry Farrell as Kat. I actually did enjoy this scene per se because it feels like a promo for a TV show. And if I saw that promo, I'd be like, okay, yeah, that actually seems pretty interesting. I really actually did enjoy that. I thought they did that really well.
It was an interesting twist on that idea.
Mm-hmm. I do love the part where Rimmer comes in and he's looking at it and he's like, no, the red light means it's not recording.
Nuh-uh, green means record.
Are you sure? Because I don't want to mess this up. It's the last message capsule we have.
Trust me and press the green button and say your message over again.
All right. Hey, that was really great. Now they'll know exactly where to find us.
Yep.
Next, they show a rework scene from the episode Marooned from Series 3 of the British show. In this, the crew abandons ship. They crash land on a deserted planet. Although in this one scene, it only shows Rimmer and Lester within a really uncomfortable scene about how Lester lost his virginity when he was 12 years old. And they like keep on insisting on it. And you're just like, yeah, I don't know about this scene. We don't really take too kindly to activity like that. In the end, the pilot didn't work because it was lacking a lot of the fundamental themes from the UK version. For example, the underlining theme of the class systems. So what happens when characters from vastly different backgrounds are stuck in a situation together where they all need to figure out what to do and how those different backgrounds, they clash with each other. So for example, you have Lister as a slacker and is of lower class, mixed with Rimmer, who is of lower class, but he wants to be of a higher status. Kochanski is of higher class and has more power. Crichton is a servant, and Kat is just an outsider who is looked upon as strange and otherly. Whereas in the US version, the dynamic really seems to be lost. And I think that's really what comes down to why Red Dwarf is so interesting and popular. And something like Firefly is so interesting and popular is because you have these dynamic backgrounds, people of different classes coming together and looking at each other as equals now, even though in any other scenario, they would kind of either look down on each other, look up to each other, or just kind of brush each other off to the side. Although we kind of get that in the US pilot with like Lester wanting to date Kachansky and Kachansky saying like, I don't think this is going to work anymore. But like, we don't really have that as much. But like in the UK pilot, we saw between Lester and Rimmer is studying really hard to be an officer. And he's like,
Lester, do you think it's easy for someone like me to become an officer? Someone who wasn't academy educated? Someone who didn't have the right knobby background? Someone who didn't have the right parents?
and that's such an impactful line to say, I didn't have the right parents. I don't have the privilege that most other people have, but I want to find a way to get out of this. Whereas he looks down at Lister as like, we are in the same boat. We come from a poor background, but you are choosing to stay down here, whereas I want to move up. And having those two types of mentality of like, they have the common denominator, but their directions are completely different, I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
Fortunately, that pilot did not get picked up, because if it did, there probably wouldn't be a Red Dwarf beyond the first 6 series. The creators would have been stuck in the US making the show after it was picked up. After that, the UK show went on to do 6 more series. They did 4 novels. There's a role-playing game. There's a video game. There's a magazine. And there was a movie in 1997. And then, like I mentioned before, there was The Promised Land, which came out in 2020. So they are still going strong to this day.
Yeah.
That's the history of Red Dwarf and how it almost became a TV show in the US.
You know, this whole experience of watching the pilots and then learning about the story behind the scenes, I keep bringing up that trope of the American remake of the British show and sexing it up and making everybody white. It really just feels like I heard a joke so many times and now I'm seeing the origin. It's like how I always heard the line, this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And then I saw Casablanca and I was like, oh, that's where that's from. And now I'm like, oh, all those gags are from this thing right here.
Yeah. Or we found the origins of Groundhog's Day. It was actually based on a book in like the 18th century called like Christmas Every Day.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, that's where it originated from. Okay.
I think somebody's going to need to go look up Escape from Walt Disney to hear more about that.
This is fascinating to see, like, and this is so early on, early 90s.
Yeah, thank you everybody who wrote in suggesting this story, because I know I probably would have never known about this story without the suggestions. So, and if people have more suggestions, email us, notgetmade@gmail.com.
Yeah, but seriously, I need an explanation for the different BBCs. I don't get it.
Different BBCs, and are there Americans who've convinced British people they were British?
Yes.
We need to know those two things.
Yes.
Can I just say, as a side note, Dan, you know, at this point, we've recorded a dozen episodes or so together. There's an aspect of this show that I did not anticipate happening, but I really enjoy that it happens. That me and you have so much other just random, like, trivia knowledge of other behind the scenes, whether it's the way the Game of Thrones pilot was received or what happened with the ending of 7. I really appreciate that we just have this platform to just, like, go off onto these weird tangents and asides of other behind the scenes stories of Hollywood.
Yeah. And that's why, kids, you always listen to the director's commentary.
Yeah, always listen. You never know what gold you're going to discover.
Yes.
I don't really have anything else to say about this. I don't want to see the American version. I could be interested in watching Red Dwarf. I think of everything that I looked up, my favorite scene that I saw was this thing about a toaster that had been deactivated because it was just so annoying about insisting on making everybody toast all the time.
Ask me a question, any question, I'll answer it.
Any question?
Yes.
How to break the speed of light? How to marry quantum mechanics and classical physics? Any question at all? Truly anything, and you will answer?
Yes.
Okay, here's my question. Would you like some toast?
In doing the research for this, I've actually ordered a lot more Indian food, more specifically chicken vindaloo, because of the main character. So yeah, chicken vindaloo. That's the way to go, you guys. It's so good and so much better than chicken tikka masala.
Well, I guess that's going to go ahead and wrap up our episode. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. You can find our website, pipedreampodcast.com, where you can find all the episodes of this show and other shows like it, like Come On Fahugwa Pods, Escape from Walt Disney, The Weird Alphabet, and more. You can subscribe to us on Patreon, on our Patreon page. You can subscribe for only $2 a month to get an extra bonus monthly show from some of us talking about whatever topics interest us or whatever's going on in the world of pop culture and in the world of Star Wars. A lot to talk about Star Wars. I mean, we're recording this just after they announced that the Boba Fett show is going to involve Robert Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
So expect in December 2021 for our Pipe Dream Unclogged to be all about Boba Fett.
Yes.
I gotta say, Dan, I really need to watch some more Robert Rodriguez movies after seeing these episodes. I realize I haven't seen most of his movies. I need to watch things like Desperado and stuff like that.
The one I like to go to, the one that made me want to be a filmmaker, was Once Upon a Time in Mexico.
I haven't seen that.
It is wild. It's insane. This is around the time that Lucas was experimenting with digital cameras. And while Robert Rodriguez was at Lucas Ranch, Lucas was doing test shots with it. He's like, oh, those cameras are really cool. He's like, yeah, if you want to try using it for your next movie, you can. He's like, oh, perfect. So that movie is one of the first fully shot on digital movies. And because of that, Rodriguez is just filming everything, and he's doing these wild shots, stuff that he could never do before when he was dealing with film. So like, this is the first movie where he can just go apeshit insane.
Cool.
Yeah.
Once Upon a Time in Mexico, putting that on my list. If you have any suggestions for us, I mean, I guess you could suggest movies to watch, but also if you have suggestions for stories that we haven't covered yet or other things, you can email us, notgetmade@gmail.com. We're also on social media. We're on Twitter at HDTNGM and Instagram at NotGetMade.
How did this not get made?
How did this not get made? Ah, come on. All three of our things are different, and I always mix it up. One day, I'll get it from memory. I really should just write it down, but I feel more proud of myself if I can remember it. So that's going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye.